Hello and welcome to this video. Today I'm going to be talking about my personal experience with building in Minecraft. I'll also be going into more detail about some of my larger projects. I've received a few comments expressing interest in my thought process when designing builds, and I thought it would be interesting to make a video discussing just that. I was going to start with some background, but later decided it wasn't completely relevant to the video, so instead I'll just jump straight into my build style. My build style is very uniform and symmetrical, though I'd like to try and change that with some future builds. I'm also very conservative with space and resources. I don't really consider myself to be terribly creative. Rather, I try to make the most out of what I have immediately available to me and build off of or modify existing structures or the environment. I also have a small design philosophy I try to keep in mind when building. I heard something similar in regards to game design, but I'm definitely paraphrasing. The meticulous details that go unnoticed are preferable to lazy craftsmanship that catches the eye immediately. Basically, if I won't see it often, I still try to keep things decorated that are visible, even if only at an angle. All of that might just be my obsessiveness talking, though, but you get the idea. As for my thought process when designing a build, I try to find a mix of both function and form, but when I start on a project, it's usually out of necessity. I'll use my iron farm as an example. For farms, before I start the design process, I need to consider a few things. The first, rates. How much iron will I need? Not too much, just enough to get by. If I needed more, the farm would need to be bigger. Second, size. How big does the farm need to be? Not too big. I can keep the farm small because I don't need that much iron. If the farm were too big, I would need to think about where I would build it a bit more. Three, location. Where am I going to build the farm? I can try to fit it in my base because I know the scale will be on the smaller side. If the location were elsewhere, I would need to consider how I would reach it in a reasonable manner. At this point, I go into a test world and try to shape the farm around my base, which would have been part of my next question. The aesthetic. What is the farm going to look like? For this, most of the block palette has already been decided because it's going to be part of the base, and my base has a very clearly defined shape since I keep it consistent. In this case, a lot of the aesthetic has already been decided for me, but when I don't have that luxury, I have to work a bit harder and ask more questions. I'll start by looking for references online, the blocks and shapes that other people use for their builds. This may or may not help skip a few steps. When figuring out a block palette, I try to pick blocks that match the environment. This helps me figure out a theme and narrow down the blocks I have to choose from. I also try to build in a way that doesn't seem out of place with the area around it as part of the theme. I also use a lot of stairs, slabs, and wall blocks because I really appreciate the shapes and depth they provide. This also limits the blocks I need to choose from. At this point, I have a few blocks picked out, and I want the rest to improve contrast and complement them. Lighting would probably come next. There aren't too many lighting options, so picking one that matches the other blocks shouldn't be too difficult. At the same time as I'm deciding on the block palette, I try to consider a lot of other utilities for the farm and how I can best incorporate them into the design, or, in other cases, design around them. It really depends on what kind of build it is and what it may require of me to use it. I really hate having to redesign something or tear it down entirely, so I try to be very careful with these details. For me, the design process of a build takes much more time than actually building it. I do, of course, make quite a few temporary farms. Usually it's because I don't yet have a clear idea of where in the world I would like it. Other times it's because I would need to complete additional projects before I can set up anything permanent. I think that about covers my general thought process when building. These steps aren't usually in the order that I've explained them though, and often it just depends on my priorities. Now I can start talking about details surrounding specific builds, starting with my base. I've always preferred to build underground. For me, it's much easier to visualize building, so I knew I wanted my base to be underground. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, the core of my base was designed by Spaghetti. I didn't know what I wanted my base to look like, so I looked for references online and found her design. I loved it. It felt warm and inviting, and it had all the basics I would need, but I knew I was going to need more space. So after debating a bit longer, I decided to just build it in a test world to see if I would be truly comfortable with it. I added a few small things like amethyst under the carpet and the deep slate pillars in the hallway. Then I took out the room at the end of the hall and worked on trying to expand. I considered a few options for the stairs, but ultimately decided I would need them to double back, so I had to design an intersection that fit the stairs and the small hallway. I tried to include the wood arches, but most of it ended up being stone. I did manage to keep the logs as support and even had them arch toward the center. My favorite aspect of the intersections has to be the basalt and bamboo. They complement each other quite well. I like the basalt for the texture, like small stones, and I chose the bamboo mostly because I thought more sweet berries was overdoing it, and I wanted more contrast. Together they added so much depth it honestly surprised me. After I had the stairs sorted, I repurposed the rooms from the original design and a bit later realized there was just enough room in the gap in the center of the floors for one of my elevator designs. I knew I was going to need it if I added more floors. I'm always forgetting stuff, and walking up and down all those stairs would drive me mad. I'm also super proud of my elevator design, so I was going to find a way to include it regardless. Before I could pick out a design, though, I needed to know how many floors I was going to have, or how many I could reasonably support. That and the floors were staggered, so I needed to figure out how that was going to look. I also wanted a block that helped it stand out from the rest of the base, but also match the aesthetic, and that ended up being copper. I thought the warm color fit with the rest of the base and also worked thematically since it was for my elevator. Electricity and all that, you know? It was originally going to be clean waxed copper, but I didn't have a bee farm, so that necessitated I build one, which meant expanding the base again. Maybe my bee farm would have made a better example earlier. And while I was doing that, the copper oxidized and I found I much preferred the cyan. It felt more at home with the rest of the base, so I kept it. I think cyan is probably my favorite color now. I seem to use it in just about all of my builds at this point. Moving on to my Nether Hub, another build out of necessity. I knew I would eventually be traveling through the Nether a lot, and similar to my base, I needed it to look good or I'd risk killing my motivation in the future. That and I needed safe transport. I think I started with the location, that being the Nether ceiling, which then influenced the shape later. I tried digging tunnels at the bottom of the Nether, but there were so many pockets of lava I gave up on that pretty quick. Next, I looked for references online. One that stuck out to me was a large room with elevated walkways extending towards the center platform. I couldn't emulate the scale, but I tried to keep the shape in mind. For the block palette, I wanted to use blocks from the Nether: blackstone, basalt, quartz, glowstone, and of course crimson and warped wood. I did like the crimson wood, but the Nether was already so red, I thought the warped wood had a much better contrast with its cool tones. I'd start by shaping the build with a primary block, blackstone, and filling in the gaps with accents. Looking back on it, I feel I learned a lot from this build, specifically about using various textures of the same block. brick blocks or blocks with borders have a very intentional look, but can feel repetitive if used too much in succession. Having it border a more dynamic block like the raw blackstone really helps enhance both. I use this technique in a lot of my other builds as well. The raw blackstone is also a deeper shade of black, which stands out more. You can kind of see it in the walkway, but I think it looks best in the floor and ceiling of the hub, as well as the arches of the tunnels, like the brick is holding back the natural blackstone in the surroundings. I also used polished blackstone walls to help bridge the gap between the floor and ceiling without the brick texture overextending. The glowstone peeking out from under the walls was also a happy accident. It adds another accent color, but is also very subtle. I struggled a lot on what to do in the corners. I think the shape was already filled out, with the gilded blackstone as a nice in-between for the glowstone. It still looked empty, so I thought about what to fill it with, and eventually landed on high explosives, because why not? But really, it added another color and element to the build, and I couldn't say no after that. For the tunnels, I kid you not, I immediately knew I wanted a checkered floor with blackstone and quartz. I don't know what prompted it, but I wasn't going to ask questions. I loved it. I don't remember a lot of the process, but I eventually landed on having blackstone arches with walls and slabs to help give it a rounded look. I also wanted to use basalt and crying obsidian in some way. The basalt along the walls and ceiling as a kind of support as well as to accentuate the build, and with the crying obsidian in the ceiling flanked by regular obsidian for contrast. I did want more depth for the floor, however, and settled on the warped nylium and roots. For utilities, obviously the soul sand or soul soil for soul speed boots, but the tunnel itself I tried to design in a way that allowed for easy corners and intersections to be modular in a way. By far my favorite build in this world, and while it did turn out to be a very expensive project, it was most definitely worth it. Moving on to my Amethyst Farm, this project I think was probably one of the most challenging, but also one of the most interesting. It's a bit hard to remember exactly what order these events took place, but I can at least describe my reasoning and other details. I decided to build an amethyst farm because I was starting to use quite a bit of it in designing my base, and I didn't like crawling back and forth through a messy cave. A proper farm was in order. Location was the starting point for this build, naturally. Geodes can't be moved, so I had to build the farm around it. As luck would have it, I had maybe 4 or 5 within chunk loading range of my base, so crystals would always be growing, as opposed to only visiting the farm when I needed crystals, but having to wait for them to grow. I did briefly consider an automatic farm, but the redstone would have been an ugly mess, and to me it felt like a bit of a waste not to showcase the geode in a more stylish build. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I have a very conservative build style. I'm not very good at building on a large scale, but this farm, she's a cruel mistress. This farm demanded I take my conservative build style that I enjoy so much and chuck it out the window. I had no choice, but fortunately, she did grant me one small concession that I be allowed to see my kids on the weekends. I mean that I be allowed to keep the build symmetrical. Yeah, that's what I meant to say. Needless to say, the room that housed the geode would need to be quite big, which meant I needed to get creative with how I decorated so much space. There were a number of ideas that came into play while considering the style and theme of this farm. The tunnel, which I'll go into more detail a bit later, helped me better define the build. I saw the farm as an extension of my base, which decided some of the block palette and initially some of the theme as well. By far the biggest contributor to the theme was the geode itself. Having such a large ornament in the center of the room made me think of an art installation or museum with it as a chandelier, and the small amount of light the crystal clusters gave off made me want to experiment with a darker lighting style with candles and glow lichen. A darker room would ensure that the geode would take center stage. For the block palette, stone, brick, andesite, spruce, and basalt came from the base. The deep slate felt important because of the location being so far underground. I wanted to include smooth basalt and calcite as a nod to the geode itself, although when I tried to include amethyst blocks, they felt a bit distracting from the centerpiece. I limited their use to under carpet, same as my base. The mossy cobble came from me wanting to use glow lichen in the build, and out of all the blocks I tried to mix it with, mossy cobble gave me the best results. When I started the build process, the first thing I needed to tackle was how on earth I would cover such large walls with detail. When in doubt, Google. I looked up wall designs and found something very similar to what I have now, but I couldn't just copy and paste it all over the wall. The repetitiveness would look terrible. I needed to break it up somehow, and if I remember correctly, I used the entrance of my base as the template for a pillar. A bit late to mention it, but I modeled it after a similar pillar design I found online, and I thought it would fit well here too. There was also the matter of the second floor, specifically the walls. The theme of the build gave me the idea to plaster various paintings along the walls. All this actually comes from a bit of design philosophy I picked up from B000100. I don't remember when I heard it or what exactly he said, but it really stuck with me for some reason. He mentions that when you have a space at least 3 blocks by 3 blocks or so, you should try to add something, anything to break up the monotony. I try to do just that whenever possible, and it helps me a lot. I mentioned treating the geode as a massive chandelier, but actually having chains connect it from the ceiling looked awful, so I scrapped that entirely. I only mention this because when I came back to the ceiling, I needed to add lighting in some way, and it took the form of large sort of lanterns. Now that I'm writing out this script, however, I remember I had the idea to have layers of glass in the ceiling to give it a sort of ominous fog effect, but like a lot of the ideas I have, it didn't pan out. One of the reasons I found this project to be so interesting was some of the utilities I needed for this build wound up taking a back seat or being ignored altogether as I worked on the design, the most important being a way to and from the farm. Immediately, I had two thoughts side by side. The first, I need to dig out a tunnel. And the second, I really hate the idea of a tunnel. The problem with this approach was if a tunnel was going to be my method of transport, I would of course need to decorate it. But the thought of trying to come up with a design to reach such an awkward location gave me such a headache. After agonizing over it for a while longer, I remembered that ender pearl stasis chambers existed. Using the stasis chamber meant I could effectively skip the entire event of walking to and from the farm. After that, the rest was pretty straightforward. Dig out a very simple tunnel and connect the two with redstone. In the event I neglected to resupply an ender pearl on either end, I still wanted a back door, so I did the bare minimum of decoration for the tunnel. The other utilities I needed, a way to reach the amethyst clusters since this was going to be a manual farm, and storage, both got thrown out over the course of the design process. For reaching the clusters, I originally had an image in my head of elevated walkways surrounding the geode. Long story short, that failed. Next, I considered having a second floor embedded in the wall with walkways that extended out toward the geode. This also failed, but I decided to keep the second floor as a viewing platform. I think the biggest reason I gave up on walkways is because they just obstructed the view of the geode, so I gave up and decided to use scaffolding whenever I needed to mine the crystals. Honestly, when it came time to figure out storage, I just couldn't be bothered. I had put it off so long that a majority of the design was finished and I didn't want to change anything. I stuffed it in the maintenance tunnel, which I thought was pretty funny considering I'm usually pretty hard-headed about those kinds of details. Finally, I'll be talking about my end hub. While I would consider this my largest build, I didn't have too much trouble filling space, probably because it was separated into smaller portions, the walkways and platforms. The desire to build this started with a need for a shulker farm. I wanted the shulker farm to be a permanent fixture and, at first, thought about building the farm on the other side of an exit gateway. When I thought about it more, I concluded I would need to clean up the main end island as a path to the farm, and my priorities ended up changing. The shape of the build was already decided since the end gateways were arranged in a circle. I did have to butcher a few things when I found I couldn't really build in partial diagonals, but while doing that, I found branching paths and just kind of rolled with it, throwing shapes around to see what looked good. Much of the block palette was also sorted given the location: endstone, purpur, obsidian, end rods. I also threw in copper because the texture was nearly identical to the purpur and the color contrast looked good. Frog lights came a bit later while considering other lighting options. I liked how the texture and color fit with the end stone and overall vibe of the end dimension. I found cobbled deep slate matched well with the bedrock of the end portal and gateways. I threw in some purple and magenta stained glass panes to match the purpur color and end rod shape. I stumbled onto the peony for its color as well, and then found mud blocks also matched up well with the deep slate. I feel as though I'm rushing the explanation for this build a bit, but I'm not really sure what else to say. A lot of what I've already explained in this video applies pretty heavily here too. Some of the logistics included making the paths reasonably wide to actually design a decent floor, as well as repositioning the end gateways to fit with the, of course, symmetrical design. I think much of the reason I keep things symmetrical is because I'm just lazy. Why build 10 different parts for a project when I could build one thing 10 times? Some of the ideas that didn't pan out for this build were arches under the walkways. I tried to encase the gateways in a gem shape or like a pylon. I wanted a pattern of slabs in the water, but couldn't for the life of me find a design I liked. I mentioned some of this in the video, and there were probably even more I can't really recall right now. A lot of my builds kind of follow the same pattern of, after I have some solid details to work with, I start throwing everything at the wall, come back a bit later and see what stuck. For this build I felt it was a lot more pronounced. Might have been indecisiveness, but I'm not really sure. I think that about covers everything: motivation, necessity, utilities, logistics, color, contrast, depth, style, themes. I hope I didn't forget anything. I have so much written down I just can't be sure anymore. More than that, I hope you found this video to be helpful or interesting. I know I did. Thank you for watching. Feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions about something I missed, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.